Religion 230, Week 13 Lecture, Missions and Revolution. The rationalism and skepticism that was at the heart of the Enlightenment continued to threaten the Church, but really Christianity as a whole. But there were Catholics who were biblical scholars, at least a few, and scientists. Galileo remained on the index until the 19th century, but Copernicus was taken off in 1758, and many Jesuits at least took up scientific study. There were a few philosophers here and there, but generally Enlightenment figures were moving in the 18th century toward being deists, who believed in a creator God, but one who was distant from creation, which was governed by natural laws. Or else they were atheists who satirized religion. The growth of the Enlightenment was also associated with the growth of Freemasonry, which was first organized in London in 1717, but spread quickly. It was originally deist, but eventually it became anti-clerical and anti-Catholic. But despite setbacks, criticism, attacks, being seen as old-fashioned and even repressive, the Church continued to grow through missions. There was competition from Protestants, rivalries between different orders, as well as the dangers of travel and living in remote places. It's estimated that between 1650 and 1700, about 500 Jesuits died from sickness or violence while serving in missions. Another issue is that missionaries did not always eradicate pagan practices, and they also failed to respect native cultures or to adapt Christianity to other civilizations. The most famous attempts to adapt Christianity to local cultures were by Matteo Ricci in China and Roberto de Nobili in India. Jesuit missionaries appreciated that if Christianity was to spread in China, there would have to be some accommodation to Chinese language and customs, particularly the customs of paying reverence to Confucius and to ancestors. Jesuits argued that these were not religious customs so much as social ones, and were no different than the European Christian practice of praying for the dead. Franciscans and Dominicans did not agree, however, and reported Jesuit missionaries to the Inquisition. In 1704, Pope Clement XI condemned the Catholic Chinese rites of offering sacrifices to Confucius and personal ancestors. The Chinese emperor responded to what he considered to be insults by expelling most missionaries and prohibiting evangelization, and that made it hard for the young church to survive. In India, de Nobili had become a Brahmin in an effort to reconcile Christianity and Indian civilization, and in 1623 Pope Gregory XV had approved his actions. But eventually, the questions over the Chinese rites led people to question methods in India, and eventually the Malabar rites, as they were known, were also suspended. But missionaries from other orders, the Oratorians, Theatines, and Carmelites, continued to establish institutions for the training of native Indian priests. Catholic missionary activities in Africa were not successful until the mid-19th century. The spread of Catholicism in the New World was mainly in Canada and South America, although there were Catholic settlements in Maryland and Louisiana. The church in Brazil, which was largely evangelized by Jesuits, was Portuguese in origin, while Spanish influence tended to dominate the rest of South America and Mexico. Colleges for the propagation of the faith were set up in Peru, Mexico, Chile, and Colombia. The Jesuits moved into California, along with Dominicans and Franciscans, who also established missions in Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico. Father Junipero Serra established a chain of missionary stations all the way to San Francisco. They were also active in European missions, too, in attempting to regain lands lost to Protestantism for the Catholic Church, and in ridding Catholic areas of superstitions and remaining pagan practices. But the Jesuits, especially because of their missionary activities, became the target of serious accusations and attacks. The film The Mission is loosely based on some of the problems the Jesuits encountered, although of course it is even more directly focused on the problems that native populations, in this case the Guarani people, faced when dealing with European colonial powers, who were interested in economic gain, both from the land and from enslaving the people. In similar cases, Jesuits were at risk because they were supporting the rights and cultures of the indigenous peoples. Missionary activities brought to the fore in many places the competition and bad feelings that had existed between the various religious orders, especially Jesuits, Franciscans, and Dominicans, for a long time. And at this time, the mid-18th century, the Jesuits found themselves at the center of focus for many enemies, not only other religious orders, but also secular priests and bishops, who didn't appreciate having to share any territory. Jansenists, who thought the Jesuits were lax, and supporters of the French Gallican Church, who saw them as foreign agents for the Pope as well as a foreign economic power. Basically, anyone who saw them as a political or an economic threat was opposed to the Jesuits, and it also tied into anti-clerical and anti-church feelings that were common in the Enlightenment. The King of France officially abolished the order in 1764, and in 1767, Jesuits in the Spanish Empire were arrested and sent into exile, and the Pope was being pressured to suppress the order. He finally did this under intense political pressure in 1773 with the brief Dominus ac Redemptor. The situation reveals the great weakness of the papacy because he couldn't even protect his most important supporters. The only places where the Jesuits were not forced out were Prussia, Russia, and the United States, and that allowed them to survive as an order. And in fact, the order was restored in 1814, when times had changed for the Church in Europe. But after the suppression of the Jesuit order, the biggest threat to the Church was still to come, and that was the French Revolution. In the 17th and 18th centuries, there were great strides made in reforming both the clergy and the religious practices of common people. Hundreds of religious orders were founded, especially in France, where these orders were frequently very involved in works of charity among the poor, establishing schools, orphanages, hospitals, and other charitable institutions. But abuses still existed, and the general trend, especially in urban areas, was that people were becoming less religious and less church-going. On the eve of the Revolution, the French Church was taken as a given. They had moral leadership, they were protected by the government, and they played a crucial part in the lives of everyone from cradle to grave. The Church controlled education, marriage, and the care of the sick. The Church had its own courts, its clergy had a privileged position, and only Catholics had rights of citizenship. It wasn't until 1787 that French people were allowed to register if they were Protestants, and to worship as Protestants, but even then it was only private worship. The French Church was exempt from taxation and had become extremely wealthy. They were the largest landowners in France. So people assumed that all religious and clergy were wealthy, even when that wasn't the case, and orders often spent a great deal on charitable care, but still the Church was wealthy and largely run by aristocrats and people appointed by the king, and this was actually the time when the practice started of addressing bishops as "my lord" and "your grace," titles that previously had been reserved for secular princes. Now some of these leaders were selfless, were good at administration and reform, and others were not. And wealth was unevenly distributed in the Church as well, and country priests were often desperately poor. In its original constitution, the new revolutionary government in France was not necessarily anti-clerical, although they did basically nationalize the church, taking over the properties and appointments to office. Many priests and even some bishops supported these moves and took it as an opportunity to reform the church. Some, interestingly enough, began to turn more toward Rome in hopes of greater unity and leadership coming from the Pope, and this move of looking toward Rome is called Ultramontanism, and it was a movement that became more important in the 19th century. But eventually, during the rule of the mob and the massacres that followed, somewhere between 2,500 and 5,000 priests were killed, along with many monks and nuns, and many thousands more were imprisoned. Church property was seized, churches closed, priests were encouraged to marry. Basically, the Catholic Church was dismantled with a revolutionary alternative set up in its place. The French, under Napoleon, invaded Italy and set up a new Roman Republic, encouraging people to give up religion altogether. They confiscated church properties, dissolved colleges, convents, and monasteries, and kicked the Pope out. He had to go out in exile. The spread of persecution here and in Spain, Germany, and Belgium helped to make faithful Catholics into counter-revolutionaries. In fact, some priests even headed guerrilla troops. But Napoleon also wanted to end schism in the French church. Basically, he wanted to end any resistance to his government. So he signed a concordat with the Pope, that is, an agreement with the Pope, which recognized Roman Catholicism as the religion of the great majority of the French people, but still maintained it largely as a national church. People were allowed, once again, to freely practice Catholicism as long as it conformed to government regulations that were thought necessary for public order. The government had to approve many things in the church. They had to approve any meetings, seminaries, holidays. But this was still a very important moment in the history of the Catholic Church, as it was the model for many other agreements with other state governments. And ironically, it ended up reducing the power of French bishops in favor of the Pope, so it supported Ultramontanism. The Pope could now depose the bishops in France, which he could not do before the Revolution because of the nature of the Gallican Church as it had been in existence. And this really helped to revive the Catholic Church in France, as well as the Pope's position. But after several more years of disagreements between Napoleon and the Pope, including the Pope's forced detention in France for 5 years, the Pope finally returned to Rome victorious, or at least strengthened, with a great deal of support, and Napoleon, after defeat in Russia and losing power at home, was sent into exile.